everyone, and welcome to this introduction to cultural anthropology. I am Professor Scaramelli. I would like to start by asking you a question. What brought you to an anthropology class? Write down your answers. Anthropology, broadly, is the study of the human experience, the sheer diversity of it, and also the things we share. On a basic level, we ask, how do we live together? How do we make meaning? How do we create and learn shared practices like reading one another, like walking, praying, dancing, working office jobs, eating a meal, and more? And what happens when one deviates from a collective norm? How do people set boundaries? How do we create categories of difference? How does power work? And how does it affect us? Anthropology reveals that the things one takes for granted are not universal. Our methods and our analytical toolkit enable us to reveal, appreciate, and analyze the diversity of human cultural practices, the social bonds, and ways of life. So we ask really big questions. For example, in this course, we will ask things like, what makes a family? How do we become a good person? How natural is the human body? How does power work? How do rituals transform us? What is the meaning of life? And what happens after death? And before birth? What is an important, a big question for you? Take a minute and write it down on a piece of paper. So these are all very big questions that anthropologists like to ask, but the answers are not universals. The answer to these questions for anthropologists are always unique. They're always unique to certain communities and individuals in specific geographic and historical context, and in complicated relationships with other human groups and individuals, and with non-humans as well, plants and animals and landscapes and climates, etc. So anthropologists study how people live in their everyday lives and within collective institutions, beliefs, and behavior. And we do that through a set of research practices that we often generally call participant observation. And you'll hear this word a lot in this course. Participant observation involves living with a community for an extended period of time, sharing everyday activities like cooking a meal, like fixing a car, attending a funeral, staging a protest, calming a baby, fighting with a neighbor, and a lot of sitting around and chatting and eating. And we understand these everyday activities and conversations in the context of the larger institutions that structure them. For example, a village council, nation states, corporations, schools, jails, temples. So to give more concrete examples, this might mean hanging out with musicians in Florida, with fishermen in Norway, working on the trading floors of the New York Stock Exchange, or even studying college students of a New England campus. We pay attention to the structures of power that subjugate and restrict people's actions, identities and possibilities, but also to how people subvert and resist power. So anthropology is about understanding individuals in their social relations to one another, forming collectives. So my question for you is, what is an example of one such collective that you are part of? And how do the relationships that you have with other members of the collective form and change who you are? The written accounts of anthropologists, which include our analysis and the broader arguments and generalizations, are called ethnographies. They're based on anthropological research, which we call ethnographic fieldwork, or sometimes just fieldwork. And it's fieldwork because it's research that you do outside of a library or outside of a computer room, though we do a lot of that too. Ethnographic fieldwork involves going out and talking to people and sharing activities with them, recording our observations and conversations and interviews as well over long periods of time, and eventually producing anthropological analysis and theory. Let's unpack the word anthropology for a second. It has an ancient Greek root. Anthro means human, and logos stands for word or for knowledge in this context. How do you say human and knowledge in your native language? How do you say anthropology? Because this class is an introduction to cultural anthropology, I'm going to talk a little bit about the concept of culture and how it came to frame what anthropology is, even if the concept itself has always been interpreted in many different and contrasting ways, and we will return to this at the end of the course. If anthropology asks really big questions, what is it that makes us human? What is it that we all share? What is it that we inherit from the contingent circumstances of history and society? And in finding answers to these questions, you'll often notice a tension between things that appear to be opposites, like culture and nature, like the universal and the particular, like patterns and diversity, like similarities and difference, like power and resistance, or structure and agency, and so forth. So take horse meat as an example, to make this very concrete. For my grandparents, it would be a delicacy. If you are from Italy or China, Mexico, Germany, Japan, chances are that you have eaten, maybe even like horse meat. And for many other people, horse meat is just a category error. If you eat it, you might feel just throwing out. The idea of it might make you sick or sad. And this is not because we have any particularly predetermined biological responses to eating horse meat. The response is learned, and it's learned within other cultural practices. For example, the idea of what makes a decent meal, what you should eat for breakfast, an appropriate food to eat for people who come to your house as guests. But the effect is bodily, it's innate, it feels natural. So we have our own idiosyncratic responses to horse meat, which draw from, for sure, but they're not entirely overdetermined by shared and collective perceptions of horse meat. So I would like you to take 1 minute and list 3 things about you that you think are natural, and 3 things about you that you understand as being cultural. So the concept of culture in anthropology broadly is a way of understanding things, of making sense of the world. Culture is embodied and is enacted, meaning it's about things you do with your body and things you do in practice as well, not just the things you think about, but the things you say you believe in. Culture is not bounded. We know that it's heterogeneous, it's contested, and it's not fixed in place or time. And we'll talk much more about this in other units of the course. In the rest of the course, we will talk about how nature and culture have been defined in shifting relationships to one another, and we'll get to unpack that puzzle a little bit. This is a puzzle that puts things in contrast, things that are supposedly essential and unchanging on one hand, to things that are constructed and malleable on the other. And you'll see this tension recur over and over again through this course. So there's an important history to the concept of culture and to its relationship to nature and to this very contrast. But for now, I just want to stick to a very simple definition. Culture is about the things we take for granted and the things that we consider to be common sense. Now let me pivot a little bit and tell you about some of the men and women who defined the field of anthropology historically. Throughout this course, we invite you to think about some of the key findings of anthropological research, ways of thinking about the world, but also the actual people and the historical, political, and personal contexts in which they conducted ethnographic research. And this is also an invitation for you to find out throughout the journey of this course what kind of anthropologist you want to be. So for this unit of the course, you'll read the first few pages of a book about the history of anthropology. The book is entitled Gods of the Upper Air, written by Charles King and published in 2019. In these early pages, you'll meet a 23-year-old American woman called Margaret Mead, arriving in American Samoa in 1925 aboard a steamer ship from San Francisco. At the time of her first trip to Samoa, Mead had just completed her master's degree at Columbia University, where she studied with a German anthropologist called Franz Boas. Boas is an important figure for the discipline, and he had come to theorize in his work that cultural forms were the outcome of historical growth and diffusion, This is just encounters between social groups. And he was responding to the widespread belief at the time that humans had evolved and proceeded along the same stages of civilization, from primitive societies to barbarism to modern society. But no society was stuck in time, Boas had argued, and societies were not unchanging or coherent units, but rather products of long histories of migration, movements, borrowings, exchanges, politics, and reinvention. And there was no evolutionary ladder either. Instead, every human group, Boas believed, confronted the same existential problems, the same puzzles, and just found different answers to them. So, as a student of Franz Boas, Margaret Mead's earlier research was basically what today we sometimes call armchair anthropology, meaning research you do by sitting in an armchair in a library room. It was based on reading and analyzing written reports collected in the university libraries. And this armchair method had been really the standard research method for anthropology in the 19th and in the early 20th century. But things were beginning to change, with fieldwork becoming the norm. And we'll talk about that in this and in the next unit of this course. So Margaret Mead now had to leave the library and go out and collect her own original data. So Margaret Mead set off to conduct anthropological fieldwork with Samoan people. And this encounter, I want to emphasize, was made possible by structures of colonialism and the United States control of Samoa since the 1900s. And we'll talk about this politics of research and colonial power relations in the next and following units of the course. I just wanted to keep it in mind. But Mead's academic goal for her trip to Samoa was about questioning a common sense idea about adolescence. This is the stage of life that many people in the United States at the time took for granted as a given. It's a phase when a sweet, compliant, or obedient child turns into a petulant, rebellious person. And the common sense belief at the time of Margaret Mead's research in the United States was that adolescence was a stage in the development of a human which also paralleled the passage of human societies from savagery and primitive societies to development and civilization, and an awkward but necessary transition from primitive childhood to more sophisticated adult life. And Franz Boas and his students absolutely rejected this idea, which reflected a belief in social evolutionism and was also based on racist ideas of the world. So Margaret Mead asked, what if adolescence was something that was just culturally learned and not universal and not the inevitable outcome of biological growth? So let me give a little gossip as well. For this trip, to embark to Samoa, Margaret Mead left behind her first husband, whom she later divorced, but she continued corresponding with her colleague and lover, a woman called Ruth Benedict, also a very important anthropologist in the United States School of Anthropology. And Mead was also involved in a romantic relationship with a linguist called Edward Sapir. And the three had all studied under Franz Boas. But when Mead went to Samoa, Sapir pleaded their shared friend, Ruth Benedict, to have Mead institutionalized. Margaret, Sapir wrote it to Ruth Benedict, was way too physically and mentally weak to undertake travel. He wrote, "A girl as frail as Margaret had simply no right to accomplish what she does." So despite these societal pressures, Mead got to Samoa and she settled on an island called Tau. And there she spent most of the days talking with young women and recording their views about growing up, their everyday practices, their feelings, and also observing what they did in their everyday life. And earlier on, she noticed that in their everyday life, the people of Samoa didn't seem to follow the rules that they were describing to her. And many of them didn't actually know much at all about the details of all of the rituals and practices that other anthropologists of Samoa and travel writers had documented. the lives of people in their everyday unfolding were really not generalizable in terms of broader cultural norms or patterns. So after eventually she returned to New York City, Margaret Mead published a book entitled Coming of Age in Samoa. The cover of the book in the first edition featured a girl wearing a grass skirt. This was not actually an attire that Samoan women would wear, but the editors were trying to sensationalize primitive society for the American public. And this kind of sensationalizing representation went really counter to what Margaret Mead was trying to accomplish. But nevertheless, the book became an absolute bestseller. So Mead's ethnography in Samoa advanced some important arguments for the time. So first, it began with the strong premise that culture is acquired. A baby is born without culture and then learns how to be a proper person. And this happens in the context of the society that surrounds the baby and patterns of learning. And this happens so through formal education, but also, and most importantly, through informal interactions, play, relationships with parents and relatives, and just the things that people do in their everyday life. And so while Americans had experienced adolescence as a period of crisis and stress, a period in which one could only comply with or rebel against the rules and expectations set by their parents, Samoan girls, at least the 50 girls that Margaret Mead had studied and talked to, were no longer responsible for babysitting their younger siblings, and they were not yet confined by their adult roles and responsibilities. So for Samoan women, adolescence was a phase of freedom, of possibility, and of exploration. So I have a couple of questions for you now that you reflect on this material. So first, what do you think the people reading Margaret Mead's book in the 1930s in the United States, what do you think they made? What did they make of these research findings? And who do you think was Margaret Mead's intended audience or audiences? And how do you think that the Samoan women and men that Mead lived with and talked to respond to her analysis? So in this first unit, I just wanted to give you a first encounter, a first flavor of the big questions of anthropology and anthropologists' capacity for probing the common sense, but also give you a little bit of a sense of the anthropological research methods, some of the core debates within the history of the discipline, and the basic terminology. In the next units of this course, we're going to talk about birth, upbringing, and learning. We will also talk about the early racist ideas that anthropologists like Mead and Boas and many others were responding to, but also their own complicity into the structures of power and colonialism and racism at the time. And finally, we will continue to delve really deep into the practical methods of participant observation, of writing ethnographic field notes and producing anthropological analysis. And you will learn to do that for yourself as well. For today, this is all. Thank you for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you all very soon.